Welcome to our next session of Policy and Politics, sponsored by Gavarim at Tiferet Israel, where we talk to members of Tiferet Israel who are involved in policy and politics, a topic of great interest to many of us, both professionally and personally. And tonight, the topic is Jewish political action. We are very pleased to have with us Rabbi Jason Kimmelman Block and Rabbi Elizabeth Richman. Ira Forman will be our moderator. Jason and Elizabeth are going to kind of probably bring up their background and how they got to where they are as part of the conversation. So I'll just say their titles. Jason Kimmelman Block is the director of Bend the Arc, Jewish Action, and director of the National Government Affairs and rabbi in residence of Bend the Arc, a Jewish Partnership for Justice. And Rabbi Elizabeth Richman is deputy director and rabbi in residence of Jews United for Justice, based in Washington, D.C. Our moderator, who we have seen a few months ago in a prior event, is Ira Forman. And working starting back in time and coming forward, Ira is the former executive director of the National Jewish Democratic Council. He is the co-editor of Jews in American Politics, published in 2001. He was Jewish Outreach Director for the Obama for America campaign for the 2012 election. From 2013 to 2017, he was Special Envoy out of the State Department to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And currently he's Adjunct Professor on Anti-Semitism at Georgetown University. So before we get started, Jason and Elizabeth asked us to play one video each that explains the work of their organization. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to share my screen. And this will take about 5 minutes, and then we'll get into the conversation. Also, Ira will be asking questions, facilitating conversation, and then we will do Q&A. And as with the other times, we ask everyone to keep muted throughout and send your questions through the chat. I will be the question catcher and facilitator, working with Ira to ask your questions. But first, the video.
My name is Ann Hoffman. I use she, her pronouns. I too am on the DC Racial Equity Team. As part of the DC Paid Family Leave Coalition, we started campaigning for and defending paid family and medical leave as a necessary right for all working families 5 years ago. This year, the district finally launched its paid family leave program on time, without hiccups, and without funding cuts, despite launching in the middle of a pandemic. Since July 1st, more than 1,000 people have been able to take advantage of paid leave benefits to care for themselves and their families. During the pandemic, we've been playing a lead role in a coalition fighting to secure emergency support for residents hurt by COVID-19, including undocumented residents and others excluded from federal aid. We launched the Just Recovery DC campaign in the spring, which was successful in preventing DC Council from cutting tens of millions of dollars from the budget and instead pushing them to raise tens of millions of dollars in new revenue to provide essential services. Some of these victories did not seem possible a year ago, not only because we didn't foresee a pandemic, but also because of who was on the council. At the end of 2019 and early in 2020, JUFJ community members and partner organizations successfully led a call for the resignation or expulsion of disgraced council member Jack Evans. Despite his egregious ethical violations and repeated decision to put his donors' profits ahead of DC's needs, Evans seemed untouchable for decades, but our collective advocacy helped push him to resign his seat on the council. JUFJ is part of the coalition that successfully advocated for the DC Council to fund the REACH Act The REACH Act will put real teeth into the statements about racial equity that elected officials like to make, requiring racial equity impact assessments, trainings, and action plans for our local government. This is an important step in the district's journey toward undoing structural harms and racism and being a place where everyone can thrive. As any parent with young kids can tell you, we all have a renewed appreciation for the essential work of child care and our education system. This year, we played a leading role in the Under 3 DC coalition effort to reverse cuts and to secure over $6 million in emergency grants for child care. This funding helps ensure child care operators and early educators can safely continue providing high-quality early learning care for our littlest residents during and after the pandemic.
We are Jewish Americans. We believe in a future for this country where everyone is free and no matter what we look like or where we come from.
We are Jewish Americans.
Yeah, Jason.
That's the wrong video.
Oh, it is?
Hi,
Yeah,
my name is Ari Brick.
it's the one called
I'm a
Tradition.
Okay,
Fund
hang
14
on.
and a proud resident of Ward 4.
Sorry.
Attorney General Racine is a meaningful ally to JUFJ.
Sounds like you've got
and to
another
all-
video clip too.
Yeah. Hang on a sec. I can't. All right. Okay, take two. This one, Jason?
Yes. Nope. Not that one. The third one.
The third one. So this is the first one.
Okay, hold on. I'm sorry. Did I only send you two?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Shoot. Okay, so just do the first one.
Okay.
Do the one you were playing before, first time.
Yeah.
So what I'll say is that this.
We are Jewish Americans.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Okay, and also before I get off, everyone, please turn off your video because we can save some bandwidth and have a better sound and picture of the speakers. Okay, next take.
We believe in a future for this country where everyone is free and safe. No matter what we look like or where we come from.
We are Jewish Americans, as diverse as this country itself.
We are one people, but have many experiences and identities.
Our people have survived genocide and fascism, deportation and slavery.
Resistance and survival are our birthright.
We are rooted in a legacy of pursuing justice, and we are rising up again.
Because the stakes for this election could not be higher.
As we mourn the lives lost in Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, and in detention centers, we know who is to blame.
Those who track hate say there is no doubt political rhetoric is in part to blame.
President Trump repeating a comment about Jewish Americans. Any Jewish person who votes Democratic is being, quote, disloyal.
U.S. Representative Steve King retweeting messages from a known Nazi sympathizer. Charlottesville was a turning point. The president's lack of a complete condemnation of what happened was cheered by white nationalists.
By setting the stage for white nationalist violence, Trump and the Republican Party represent the greatest threat to Jews in this country.
When it comes to white supremacists and neo-Nazis marching in the street, there is only one side.
We know, as a Jewish community, our safety is dependent on the safety of all people.
In 2020, Bend the Arc Jewish Action is mobilizing Jews and allies across the country to remove white nationalists from office.
We were made for this moment.
We won't let politicians harm our communities to expand their own wealth and power.
We're going to hold those politicians accountable in November.
A more just America is possible, and we will build it together in solidarity.
I'm an American Jew, and I'm rising up for a future in which we are all free and safe.
I'm rising for LGBT equality.
For working class people.
For a thriving planet.
For progress.
We are ready. We rise as one.
Ira, it's yours.
Thank you, Andrew. So it seems clear to me, even though I wasn't involved in the planning of this program, why we're dealing and hearing from these two organizations who are deeply committed to social justice in Martin Luther King's weekend. And so one of my favorite quotes is the King quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." I assume, Jason, that's where you got your organization's name. And it kind of, I think, for me at least, sets the tone for my optimism about the future of this country, the future of the Jewish people. But I guess for many of us, including me in this time, optimism is a little hard to think about. That does the arc bend toward justice? But I don't know how to operate in the world without believing that. So that's why I think this is such a great program tonight. I'm looking forward to hearing from both of you. Jason and then Elizabeth, can you start by talking to us? You gave us in these videos kind of an overview of a little bit of your programs, but talk to us about your overall mission and how they translate into your most important programs. And in particular, what do you think your successes have been in the last few years? Jason, first.
Sure. Thanks, Ira. Really great to have this conversation here with Elizabeth. And one thing that folks should know is that Bend the Arc and JUFJ are sibling organizations. JUFJ works on the local level, and there are a number of other cities that have similar organizations, and Bend the Arc works on a national level, and we have localities, but we have a very similar approach to how we look at social change. So one aspect of our approach is that we don't do our work alone. We work as allies and in coalition with communities that are not Jewish. And if in cases where, like for example, for an issue like immigration, we will always take the lead of directly impacted communities. So in cases of immigration, immigrant groups are leading, and we are bringing resources and what Jewish community has to offer. So we organize Jews, we organize people, we organize ideas, we organize money to help advance those issues led by our partners. In terms of just how we approach the work, we have a couple of key principles. One is to stand with communities that are under attack. Communities that are being targeted in this political moment by politicians who are trying to scapegoat and trying to sort of keep their power and money through attacking immigrants, through attacking Muslims, through attacking people of color. So part of what we're doing is solidarity work. Part of what we're doing is holding leaders accountable. So we do advocacy on the national level. primarily. That's my job as the Washington director, is vis-a-vis Congress, the administration. But part of that work, we feel like we do it most effectively when we're also holding elected officials accountable. And so that does mean electoral work. The video you saw, was obviously an electoral video. It's not the only mode that we work in. And then the other piece, the other track that we work on is working on winning victories and helping to mobilize in cities and states across the country, as well as Washington, to move the needle on issues like criminal justice, on immigrant justice, economic equity. So I think I'll just stop there. I think we can talk a little later about specific programs, but I would say the key areas that we work in is, we do run leadership programs to help train people to be effective advocates and organizers. We do organizing and advocacy. We have our local groups. We call them, instead of chapters, we call them moral minions. And so people create a minion in their local community. We have just about 30 around the country in over 20 different, over 22 states across the country, not just the obvious places where people think Jews live. And then another piece that we do is public voice. So trying to shape the narrative of what the country is talking about, how politicians understand the American Jewish community and what our political priorities are, and how the public understands that as well is a big part of what we do. And I can go in a little more depth with that a little later.
Elizabeth.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Ira, and thanks to everybody for being here. And that was really a great setup because, as Jason said, we're different organizations, but we really work in ways that are complementary to one another, and we share many of the same principles. So Bend the Arc works nationally. JUFJ, I like to say, has a hyper-local mission. We only work in DC and in Maryland. And it used to be that we only worked in Montgomery County, Maryland, but we have a very strong Baltimore office now, and increasingly we're actually doing statewide work in Maryland. And part of the reason we were founded, and I know that many in the JUFJ community were around in the early days, so you may be able to talk about this more than I can, but we know that so many people move to our region to work on the really big splashy issues that are in the news. They come here to work on the things that Jason was talking about at the federal level. They come here to work on the Hill. They come here to do international relations. And what we found, among other things, was that people weren't really connecting with either the city, if you were in DC, or with your county, if you were in Montgomery County or further out in Maryland. And what's very easy to forget in a region like ours is that we have cities and counties with really unique strengths and also some really unique challenges. And many of the same issues that are playing out on the local level are also playing out here locally. So we focus, we have like a bright red line. We very occasionally will sign onto something that has to do with a national issue, but 99.8% of the time, we only work in DC and Maryland. And the way we do that is we say that our mission is to create real, concrete change in people's lives, to improve the lives of people in this region, and to build the power of groups that have traditionally been marginalized from the political process. So people of color, poor and working class folks, people who are really deliberately excluded from the political process, very particularly in our region, but also across the country. And we do that by focusing on social, racial, and economic equity. We teach people how to get involved in civic activity. We primarily function through the legislative process, which is a little bit different than Bend the Arc. We do a little bit less of what we call narrative change, trying to change the language that people use to talk about a particular issue. We're sort of like more nose to the grindstone, focusing on particular issues through the legislative process. And so we teach people how to how to show up and engage with their legislators and give testimony around a particular bill, how to write letters to people that can make change on a particular issue, basically how to show up and get it done. And our issues, again, social, political, and economic, so very similar in many ways to Jason's. We work on affordable housing. We work on the protection of immigrants. We work on policing accountability. We, heart and soul is really in economic equity issues. So you heard in the video about TC, we spearheaded the campaign that took 5 years to establish a paid family and medical leave program that just started and is working really successfully. We advocated successfully to make sure that everybody in DC and Maryland has access to paid sick days, no matter who your employer is, that sort of thing. So we do issue work, issue politics, issue campaigning through the techniques of community organizing. That said, also like Jason, we have leadership programs. We teach people how to really get in touch with their Jewish identity and how to become an advocate or a community organizer as a volunteer through a Jewish context. We'll talk about this later in the program, but we have what we call a C4, which is a sister organization, the Jews United for Justice Campaign Fund, that does electoral politics. We endorse candidates, not me. I don't work for them typically, but that organization endorses candidates, and we can talk more about that later. But typically we go after, we like to say, sort of the far edge of the possible. How is it possible to make change here? And what's fun about it is that our region, we're really like the laboratory of the country in many ways. All eyes are on us, sometimes for good, sometimes less for good, as the last week has shown us. But because our legislators, by and large, tend to be more liberal, more progressive than many other places in the country, if we can pull something off here, like a paid family and medical leave program or paid sick days or whatever it is, that tends to ripple out through the rest of the country, and people take what we do here and they often improve on it. We're sort of like the proving grounds, but it's fun. It's often high stakes and high pressure, but because our legislators tend to be, again, more progressive, we can actually accomplish more with fewer resources and fewer people here than you could say in New York or Los Angeles. So it is a lot of fun. We started out, I'll just say, speaking of number of people, we started out, I was our third employee back in 2009. And for those of you who may not have caught up with us since then, we now have a staff of 20 people. And it's just been exponential growth over the last couple of years. And we are, I believe we're the largest community organizing group in DC and certainly up there in the region.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm interested in hearing from both of you about how the last 4 years has changed not just your programs, but perhaps your mission. I mean, for me, to look back at 2016, it doesn't seem like 4 years, it seems like ages ago. So would you talk to me a little bit about how those things have played out? I'm really interested in both of you. 20 years ago, C3s rarely got involved in political action directly, didn't have C4s except for organizations like that I used to be with, which were directly partisan. So I'm interested in how that's evolved as well with you guys, and why do you see that so important to your mission? And I know, Elizabeth, you don't do national, but I look at things like you have a congressman in Maryland who's calling our election, who's calling the election fraudulent. We have the whole issue of DC statehood, which is much more prominent. So I assume it affects you as well. So Elizabeth, let's hear from you first, and then Jason.
So I actually think that in many ways, JUFJ has had the luxury of not having to reinvent itself over the last 4 years because we were always a local group. So our context, like you said, our context certainly has changed and we're operating in a different environment, but our mission remained largely the same. And it was about 4 years ago, somebody shared a chart with me, and was an organization that's a coalition of progressive organizations. And they were thinking about how the strategy of progressive organizations across the country needed to change in response to the new administration in 2016. And the theory that I buy was that we needed 3 categories of organizations. There were we needed mediators, we needed fighters, and we needed winners. And so the mediators, we needed like a small percentage of mediators out there who were willing to do bipartisan work, reach out across the aisle, keep going on the issues where some progress could be made nationally, transportation bill, whatever it was, and would keep whatever could be kept moving, would keep moving. The largest chunk, according to this theory, that we needed were the fighters. And those were organizations that were just going to resist anything that the current administration wanted to do that was wrong. They were not going to give an inch. And I would put Bend the Arc in that category. I don't know, Jason, you can say how you would self-define. And then there was this medium category of winners. And those were primarily local organizations who we're going to say, even though things are looking bad at the national level, let me show you what's possible at the local level, even in such terrible, traumatic times where everything feels paralyzed and frozen, if not regressive on the national level. And let's show you how change can be made. And when I read that, it immediately clicked that that was what JUFJ was. It was also very nice to call myself a winner, and not feel immodest about it. But really, that's what we've done over the last 4 years. We've won a number of victories on the local level that really feel like they should be impossible in these last 4 years of paralysis and trauma. But what we've tried to do is keep a vision alive for what a multiracial, multi-ethnic society pushing for change that lifts all of us can look like, so that, God willing, when the current situation has closed itself out and we're able to start working again on change at the national level, we have some local models for what that might look like. So we've kind of kept going. The environment's gotten more tense. We don't actually deal very much with Maryland congresspeople and whatever their opinions are. DC statehood, when it looked like things were moving 11, 12 years ago, we did glom onto a local effort there, but weren't directing it. So we've sort of pursued our own agenda over the last 4 years. And let me stop for a minute and let Jason talk, and then we can talk about the C4 aspect of things.
Yeah, sure. So I'll back up a little bit to say, Bend the Arc was constituted in this form by some antecedent organizations 10 years ago now, in 2011. That's what's 10 years, yes. So it was in the first term of the Obama administration, very different political moment. But the theory of why Bend the Arc needed to exist, we are domestic only. We just work on issues of transformation of American society. But our theory is that there was a huge gap between what American Jews' political priorities and views are and what national Jewish organizations who claim to speak for the American Jewish community focus on. And to be frank, the national Jewish organizations were to the center or center right of the community and almost singularly focused on Israel advocacy. Not 100%, but many, that's the top issue for those organizations. When you ask American Jews, what are your top political priorities? They will talk about issues that are close to home, and only about 9% list Israel advocacy as their number one issue. And so we wanted to fill that gap. The other gap that we wanted to fill was in the political sphere. And by the political sphere, I mean organizations that can do electoral work, which, in the technical term, 501c4. Now we're structured that we have a 501c3, which is your classic nonprofit. We also have a sister organization that's a 501c4 that does political work, does endorsements, speaks in a political voice, and also has a political action committee where we raise and allocate money for political candidates that we support. So when we founded our C4, there were only, we were the sixth Jewish C4 in the country. One was the National Jewish Democratic Council, which Ira led so ably for so long. There was the Republican Jewish Committee. So those are two, explicitly partisan organizations that their mission is to have Jews vote for the party that they represent. There was AIPAC, there was J Street, there's the Jewish War Veterans who had that on the books, but they didn't really use their C4 all that much, and there was us. And so as a result, we were the only C4 to be exclusively focused on domestic issues close to home. And when we founded our political action committee, there were 34, we were the 34th Jewish identified PAC, and the only one focused on domestic policy. And so we felt there was a big gap there. And we also felt that there was a gap in terms of speaking a national Jewish voice that would speak boldly on progressive issues. There was a time, couple generations ago, when groups like the American Jewish Congress, at times the Anti-Defamation League had that voice. The American Jewish Congress was one of the key organizers of the March on Washington, but that organization, is essentially defunct by 2011, and groups like the ADL, in our view, had moved far too far to the center and center right on many issues, had separated themselves from the classic civil rights community that they came from. And so we wanted to be that bold national voice. When Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president, we quickly recognized the threat that he was, and immediately launched a campaign to try to raise the alarm bells that this is not just a regular conservative politician, which we would disagree with on policy issues, but we saw him as an existential threat to people, to communities, as well as to democracy. And unfortunately, that has borne out. So we launched a campaign initially called "We've Seen This Before," to raise the alarm bells around this. The Nation magazine called it the campaign of 2016 in terms of shaping narrative about what the stakes were. And another place where this gap was drawn, was made very, very clear, is the day after the 2016 election, the Jewish Federations of North America, which is kind of an umbrella group for all the different federations around, released a letter congratulating Donald Trump and Mike Pence on their victory on behalf of the Jewish community, which many American Jews, us included, thought was a complete misunderstanding of the situation that we were in, that it was playing by the same old playbook that, we don't want to be partisan, we don't want to take sides, whoever wins an election, and we will, in our view, pretend or convince ourselves that this was just a normal election. And our response the day after the election was to release an open letter from American Jews to communities that were targeted, to the Muslim community, to the immigrant community, to communities of color, to say that we're with you, that the Jewish community is not going to try to go along to get along, is going to fight what we believed was coming, and unfortunately was the case. And we organized over 45,000 people to get behind that letter right away. And just a couple of examples. And the other thing I would say, just big picture, is as a result of that stance, the last 4 years, Bend the Arc has grown tremendously. Our budget and staff has more than doubled in that time. We have upwards of 50 people working for us right now. 3 years ago today, I see that it's January 17th, we organized during the DACA fight, the largest Jewish civil disobedience action on Capitol Hill, where we did a civil disobedience action in the Russell building, Russell Senate office building. And what was powerful about that was not just that we had, Jews from every part of the Jewish community, white, Black, Orthodox, secular, rabbis, regular folks. But it was done at a very strategic moment. It was a moment in the DACA fight where Dreamers had been calling for more escalation. Dreamers themselves had been doing civil disobedience for all along at great risk to themselves, and asked other allies, this is the time to escalate because the Senate fight is happening right now. And so this was done at a moment where all eyes were on this particular political fight, and it became a big part of the national story that people who weren't Dreamers, who weren't immigrants, were willing to put their bodies on the line to stand up for what was right at that time. Another important success that I would name was in the wake of the massacre at the Tree of Light Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We had been tracking the white nationalist movement for a long time. We've been very concerned about how political leaders were whipping up hatred, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism in the lead up to the 2018 election. People may not recall that the Pittsburgh massacre occurred 10 days before the midterm elections. Later on, we commissioned a report with a think tank that looked at exactly the conspiracy theories that the murderer was inspired by, and how those conspiracy theories spread from the dark parts of the web to Congressman Matt Gaetz to President Trump, and were amplified by the right-wing media. So, which of course led to the biggest, the most deadly pogrom in American history. So, immediately upon the massacre, that late that Saturday night and into Sunday morning, our Bend the Arc's moral minion in Pittsburgh, we had an incredible group of leaders in Pittsburgh, said we need to shape how people understand what just happened. That this was not just another issue of gun violence. This was not just similar to a school shooting or, just another horrible massacre. But this was actually something that was instigated by political leaders and instigated by the president. And so our leaders in Pittsburgh drafted an open letter from American Jews that essentially said that the president was not welcome to come to Pittsburgh to mourn until he denounced white nationalism, clearly. And what was important about that letter is it became part of how people understood what had just happened. That in every single every single media story covering the massacre, the massacre, mentioned these leaders from Pittsburgh who understood what had happened in a very specific way, and it shaped how the country understood what was happening. And then when the president actually did come to Pittsburgh, Pittsburghers from all walks of life poured into the street to mourn, to sing together, to say we're standing together against hate, and actually turned the president's motorcade around. There were so many people in Squirrel Hill at that time. I know I'm going on a little long, but the last thing I would say is the final thing that I think is important to lift up is the video we showed at the beginning was for our campaign called We Rise as One, which was about harnessing anger and power of Jewish Americans to take on white nationalism, to remove leaders who were mainstreaming white nationalism, including President Trump, including the people who support him, and also what part of what we saw is that Republicans were increasingly whipping up anti-Semitism in order to gain power. The closing argument of the 2016 election, President Trump released a notorious election campaign video. It was his closing argument that just named every anti-Semitic trope in the book, from Soros to there's a cabal of people trying to control your lives, and so we wanted to point out that that's actually been part of a pattern. And so part of what we did was shape the narrative about the election. We created a website called howtofightAntisemitism.com, which was cataloging all the anti-Semitism that political leaders were manufacturing. We also did research and drove news stories. So for example, people probably heard of the news story of when Trump's campaign were using the symbol that Nazis use for political opponents to tar Antifa, and this was the first time Facebook actually took down an ad because it violated their policies. That was a story that we broke. When Kelly Loeffler in Georgia tried to claim that she was friends of the Jewish community and accuse her opponent of being anti-Semitic because he had some things to say that were positive about Palestinian human rights, but at the same time she was posing and taking selfies with members of the KKK on a regular basis. We were able to expose that and to put that into the national story. The other pieces of what we were able to do in the election campaign were to organize people to make calls and send texts to swing voters. Organized over 5 million calls and texts to Jewish and swing voters in 6 swing states, which is, we're pretty sure, the largest Jewish voter mobilization program, definitely this cycle, possibly ever. And our political action committee raised over $1 million to support our endorsed candidates. So we felt like, even though the Jewish community is small, that we actually had a real impact and made a real contribution to the results in this in this campaign season.
Elizabeth, can you go back and address your kind of political action, your C4, and you've got I know you've done some things in Montgomery County elections and got elections coming up. You obviously did a lot with Jack Evans in the council, and we got elections in DC, the local elections. Can you talk a little bit about your view of this and why that's important to your mission?
Sure can. So the motivation, Jason told a little bit of the story of how their C4 came about and what it looked like on the national landscape when that happened. We were a little bit later in that process, although I will say that we were inspired by Bend the Arc to create a C4. And our calculus looked a little bit different because, again, we're working in this region where governments tend to be more liberal and progressive than in other parts of the country. So interestingly, what we were finding was that basically, I mean, in DC, you don't get elected to office unless you're a Democrat. Every once in a while, a stray Republican gets elected to the council, or somebody changes their party affiliation from Democratic to independent to get elected, because we do need to have a certain number of independents on the DC council. But generally speaking, folks are Democratic leaning around here, and it's hard to cut through the noise. In other parts of America, we know that people tend to vote party affiliation. So even if they don't know much about the Democrat and they themselves happen to be affiliated Democratic, they'll vote for the Democrat. Here, it's very hard to do that because everybody's calling themselves a Democrat. And so part of what we were trying to do with starting a C4 was to start distinguishing between candidates and really bringing out the shades of nuance and trying to understand better and help people in our region understand better what it was that candidates running for office really stood for and what the variances were in their positions within that sort of more narrow spectrum. So we started the C4, which is intended to, again, we endorse candidates for office, so we do make recommendations on that front, but we also do work with elected officials to get our legislation passed, and as Jason was saying, to really hold them accountable to working in the best interests of all people, not just the wealthy folks and not just the white folks who have traditionally been taken account of to a much greater extent in politics than other folks. So the criteria when we endorse someone, they at a very minimum, they have to meet 4 criteria. They have to be aligned with our social, economic, and racial justice agenda and really be working toward those issues. They need to have high ethical standards, which is, I'm sorry that we need to include that as a category, but we really do. Many of our local officials have been challenged in that regard, and we feel very strongly integrity is one of our top and most dearly held values, and we want to see that in our elected officials as well. They need to have a commitment to racial equity. It's really the issue of our times, and they need to be working toward equity on that front. And then we're also just a very pragmatic organization. A candidate has to have a real chance of winning. We don't endorse candidates, even if they align on the other things, if they really have no chance of winning. Maybe once in a blue moon, we would consider doing that, and we have done that for various reasons, but generally speaking, they have to have a real chance of winning. So we've actually had great success over the last couple of years. I don't have statistics, but a majority of the folks that we've endorsed have won, and really proud to say that we have changed the composition. We and our partners have helped change the composition of the council members in DC and Montgomery County. The DC council, I would say, is more progressive than it's ever been, and maybe almost even more importantly, is less corrupt and is really adhering to higher ethical standards than certainly in my time here. And I really do think that we've had a hand in that, because across the region, and particularly in DC, elections are won by the most ridiculously slim margins. People have won very important council elections in DC by 83 votes, by, in some cases, 12 votes. Really, really very small. And we can mobilize, we can speak to 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 voters in an election, and we produce voter guides, and that actually really accounts for something, so that I do believe that we've changed the course of elections. The other piece of what we do is that we endorse on issues. So for example, in Maryland, we endorsed, there were 7 ballot questions on for decision in this past election, some at the statewide level, some in Baltimore, some in Montgomery County. In Montgomery County, it was the most epic struggle on ballot questions that the county has ever seen since at least 2004. And what happened was that there is, I'm just going to call him a Trumpist, but a far right politician whose name is, not even a politician, but activist, whose name is Robin Ficker, who lives in Montgomery County. He's been around for many, many years, and for many years has been trying to eliminate taxes from Montgomery County. He was the activist behind the effort to term limit our county council members, and basically to enact a fairly far right agenda in Montgomery County, which is not the most obvious place where one might go about trying to do that. But he's been so persistent in putting ballot question after ballot question after ballot question up for a vote in election after election. So in this particular election, there were essentially two issues, 4 ballot questions, but 2 issues at stake. One was extremely complicated, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it had to do with property taxes and whether the county council in Montgomery County was allowed to raise property taxes beyond, there's a cap, and beyond the cap that currently exists. And this activist, Robin Ficker, put a question, a ballot question on for a vote, saying that that would no longer be possible. The county council for all time would basically have no power to do that. And so that meant that Montgomery County would no longer be able to raise revenue through its most predictable and most robust stream of revenue. So they couldn't raise money to deal with the problems caused by COVID-19. They couldn't raise money to fund schools. They couldn't raise money for all the social services that our taxes pay for. And then there was another group that put an effort on the ballot that, and I know we had some discussion about this on the listserv at TI, about eliminating the at-large council positions in Montgomery County. So it was pretty clear to my organization that either way was the right thing to go. We believe in taxes. We believe deeply in paying taxes. I love paying my taxes because that is how we create the society that we want to live in. And absolutely nothing that JUFJ works for in Montgomery County would be possible if there was no revenue to make it possible. So that was a no-brainer. And we also feel like diminishing democracy by giving people 4 fewer representatives to go to with their concerns when they wanted to talk to an elected leader also did not make sense. However, these were very, very wonky questions. They were questions about taxes. They were questions about government structures that most people don't tend to think about. And the answer is not obvious. I mean, the answer may not be obvious anyway, but it's certainly not obvious on the face of it. And nobody was moving. Nobody was doing anything about it. All the usual activists in Montgomery County were just, they just felt like it was just going to happen and they were powerless to stop it. And they were pretty sure that this amendment to put the kibosh on raising taxes and raising revenue was going to happen. And so, although we did not have a whole lot of capacity, we decided that we just couldn't not get into the fight. So our specialty is in bringing together diverse groups of people and organizations who might or might not have ever worked together before around a common vision. And partly that's because we're so pragmatic. We're not interested in using the coolest or the hippest or the most correct terms for whatever political ends we are striving after. We're really interested in helping from a values perspective. We're a Jewish organization, helping people understand how their Jewish values are inherent in the world of politics and sort of showing them the options on a particular issue. And by doing that, we're really able to bring pretty diverse people into coalition with one another. So what we did was we had this shared vision of what a better Montgomery County would look like. It was a Montgomery County that would lift all of its residents and to fix our broken tax system and to have a strong social safety net and to strengthen local democracy, not to eviscerate it. And we took that vision to the organizations in the county and we put together and we led a big new coalition of labor groups, faith groups, nonprofits, business groups, students, parents, teachers, you name it. Just as an illustration, it's very rare that you would find the local chamber of commerce sitting in the same coalition as the local representatives of the Democratic Socialists of America. Those are not 2 groups that typically hang out together. But we brought them together because it was pretty clear that everybody's interests were going to be served in fighting these ballot questions and supporting others. So we went from like 0 to 60 in about 3 weeks and had conversations in all the places where we have relationships and brought people in and managed to bring in money. And it just became a juggernaut. And we I forget how many people in the end were part of the coalition, but 20, 30, or not people, but organizations, 20, 30 groups really worked together to stop what we felt like were some extremely dangerous ballot questions and to win. And in the process, it's really a story of Montgomery County coming together in a way that I don't think the county has seen in close to a decade, 15 years, certainly, where we're able to transcend differences and work toward a common vision. And there's a tremendous amount of excitement coming out of that win or that pair of wins to say, what else could we do? What if we work together? How could we lift up all of our residents and make life here better for everyone? And people are looking around, what's the next thing for us to work on? And that's very typical of how JUFJ works. We're not flashy. We don't have a great communications department. We don't do fancy media. We're really about relationships and bringing people together and being smart and paying attention to the details and winning. So there
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jason. Both of you are clearly very passionate about your work. I have a bunch more questions, but I think we want to let this be opened up to our other participants now. I hope at some point you guys you'll have the opportunity in these questions, maybe to talk a little bit. I'm real interested in the fissures in the American Jewish community. Jason, you mentioned the kind of establishment organizations, big centers that are right, but the differences in just, Elizabeth, you talk about Jewish values. Much of the Orthodox community would say, prophetic tradition emphasis is not their values. I'd love to hear how you guys look at those splits and how, if there's any way you think that gap can be bridged within, even if we don't agree on everything, this huge gap in the American Jewish community. So, but without further ado, Andrew, do we have some questions in the chat room for
They are starting to come in. I want to check with Jason. Jason, do you want me to show your second video?
I think we could go either way.
It's just 2 minutes. It's just 2 minutes. So I'll show it.
Okay.
Because you guys just produced it 2 weeks ago, right?
Yeah, the video I wanted to show, it does have a summary, a bit of a summary of the work that we've done since 2016 and what we're thinking about moving on.
I can't see the plate. There we go. Okay.
In 2016, we made a promise.
We are with you now.
And we will be with you every day for the next 4 years.
45,000 of you signed our open letter to rise up in solidarity with all people threatened by white nationalism, to rise up for our Jewish values of social justice. Jews across the country showed up and grew our movement. And in the face of fascism, hatred, and division, we rose as one.
Jewish leaders are currently marching to the Capitol Rotunda to defend Dreamers and demand a clean DACA bill.
I am here because a Muslim ban is an insult to me as an American and as a Jew.
We confronted those who put our community in danger.
When it comes to white supremacists and neo-Nazis marching in the street, there is only one side.
And after the worst pogrom in our country's history, our leaders made their voices heard.
A petition from the leaders of a Pittsburgh-based Jewish group was signed by over 76,000 people.
We know as a Jewish community that our safety is dependent on the safety of all people.
We helped to change history.
The 116th U.S. Congress that opens in January will be the most diverse ever.
And in 2020, we pressed on against all odds and made a brighter future possible.
Donald Trump will be denied a second term. That has not happened since 1992.
We kept our promise to never stop fighting, and we delivered. So here's a new promise. We promise to keep moving forward, to repair all the damage of the last 4 years, to confront the truth of the last 400 years, to build toward a new America where all are truly safe and free. There's more work to do, but our ancestors gave us the blueprint. We promise to make them proud.
To our future descendants who ask, what did we do during these horrific, painful years? We will be able to say without a doubt that we rose up with moral courage and in revolutionary love so that they could have a future.
We are Jewish Americans. We are Bend the Arc.
That was great.
It's interesting, just to say a word, seeing that JUFJ is a little bit, I think we share many of the same values as Bend the Arc, but as I was saying before, I think we speak in a little bit of a different language, or a little bit more subdued isn't the right word, but we try and speak less specifically and more broadly, again, trying to get gather people in around the ideas rather than being, I guess, in your face. And not saying in your face is a bad thing. In your face was really important over the last couple of years. But one of the things that I neglected to say earlier was that we are very, we focus on hope, and the number of times, but we really think that speaking hopefully and not being antagonistic, except when we absolutely have to, really brings out the best in people for the kind of work that JUFJ is doing. So I could, on like the fingers of one hand, I think I could count the number of times that we've called out any particular elected official for anything. And you saw one of them in that video about former council member Jack Evans. So but I can do that because I know that Bend the Arc is doing what they're doing at the national level. So I do think our missions are really complementary to one another.
Jason, Elizabeth, can you speak about your personal trajectories that you went to Jewish Theological Seminary? You are rabbis, you're both rabbis in residence. So speak a bit about your path that brought you to these positions and this kind of work, which is not work one usually sees a rabbi doing.
Did I go first? Okay. Let's see. So I was always interested in politics. I was always interested in social change. It's always been a passion of mine. I grew up, in a Reform synagogue and did, went to the Soviet Jewry marches in New York City in the 80s. Like that was, part of my political consciousness, and the other part was, going to nuclear disarmament and other kind of peace marches of that time in the 80s when I was in high school. And when as people know, I've been in the congregation for a long time, but I initially came to Washington and worked for an organization called Panim, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was an educational group that trained young people about how Judaism has a lot to say about social issues, about when you look at issues like poverty and human rights and the environment, there is so much in Judaism, both in terms of like the content of how to understand those issues, but also in terms of not just, we used to say that in America you have the opportunity to get involved and make change, but in Judaism it's an obligation. We're commanded to, and so bringing that into the world was both shaped me and shaped my understanding of Judaism and what we're about. And when I went to JTS a couple years before Elizabeth, but I think we were there at similar eras. There was not a path for rabbis to graduate from JTS and then work for social justice organizations. That wasn't something that people really did. just because the organizations, the field as a whole was immature at that time. There weren't that many organizations. They hadn't grown to the point that they have now. So I think for both of us, we kind of forged our own path professionally and kind of like worked out of the box. And now when you go to rabbinical schools or, talk to people applying to rabbinical school, about like half of them want to make social justice work part of their rabbinate in some way, no matter what the context is that they work in. So there has been a real, I think, transformation, at least in the conservative movement that I've seen, but I think in parts of the Orthodox movement and in the Reform movement is a little different culturally, because social justice work has been part of how the Reform movement understands itself for a long time. But I've seen, just a lot of good growth in that area. So
And I'm someone, I grew up in the conservative movement, although the way my synagogue and my family practice is different from the way that I practice now. And my interest in Judaism really deepened when I got to college, and I started to toy with this idea of becoming a rabbi, not particularly having anything to do with a social justice path. But at that point in my life, I happened to know a fair number of rabbis, mostly working in pulpits, and none of them were particularly happy. Their lives were hard, and many of them had sort of lost touch with the passion that they had once felt going into the rabbinate. So somehow, as a 22-year-old, I don't know how I managed this, but I was smart enough for myself not to go straight to rabbinical school, and to say, let me try a few other things that I'm interested in before pursuing that path. And I came to Washington for the first time in the late 90s and did what was social change work, but in different sorts of contexts. I first worked internationally on human rights and the development of democracy and strengthening of democracy. I worked for a private organization, then I worked for USAID, and thought I wanted to keep pursuing international human rights. And if you do that in DC, or at least if you did that in the 90s, people said, oh, you have to become a lawyer. So I moved to New York City, about a mile and a half from the towers, 2 weeks before they fell, and had a really hard first year at NYU Law School, and couldn't quite figure out why I was there. And there was a lot of upheaval. So sort of rekindled my involvement in the Jewish community, and spent that year in school really doing other things in the Jewish community, and had the opportunity to touch base with a different kind of social change work, which was much more locally rooted, had less to do with international things, and a recognition that some of the same problems that I was trying to solve in sub-Saharan Africa were actually much greater problems, or at least equal problems here at home. And kind of did that kind of work for a while, and the local community development and social change work. And then I happened very briefly to be working for a summer out in Oakland, California, for a community law center, and really had the blessing of working with a community of Latino women who really fused in a way that I had never seen before their personal identities and their stories of how they grew up and who their families were with the work that they were doing. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head, where I said, aha, the Jewish community has, right, we have these prophetic values, however you want to interpret them, and we have resources, and I want to be Jewish, and I want to do this work, and I want to be a rabbi encouraging the Jewish community to do this work. And somehow it had never occurred to me that I could do both before, probably because when I first spoke to somebody at JTS about this back in college, the dean of the school said, well, you can't come here and do that. There's no path to be a social justice rabbi. So eventually, it took me a couple more years, but eventually I went back and like Jason said, forged my own path. Except that when I graduated, the rabbis in residence of American Jewish World Service and Panim and JCUA out in Chicago, and a whole variety of other organizations, were conservative rabbis. They were my friends who I had studied with in school. And now the field has really matured. Like Jason was saying, there is such a thing as the Jewish social justice field that JUFJ and that Bend the Arc has actually worked quite hard to nurture. And there are actually structures now, and there's something called the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. And my longtime chavruta from rabbinical school, the person I studied Talmud with that had nothing to do with social justice, is now running, she's a dean at JTS, and she's running the JTS Center on Social Justice. So it's actually not unusual anymore to find rabbis doing this work. And I think I've seen that maturation in JUFJ as well, in that many of our founding generation were culturally Jewish and like very deeply culturally Jewish, but not necessarily religiously Jewish, or at least not such that they wanted to put out there in the public square. And now I find, particularly with the younger generation, that people really want to meld their actually explicitly religious identity with social justice. So we're doing things like building a sukkah in front of the DC council chambers, and we're delivering Shalach Manot on Purim to the entire Maryland General Assembly. And we're praying, like we put on a Shabbat service before the family separation rally that we participated in. So I never know what to make of this because, right, there are trends around the secularization of the American left, but in the world in which I function, people are really increasingly interested in their Jewish identity and how it fits together with justice activism.
Interesting.
Thanks. So I have a follow-up question, and then I'd like to go back to Ira's, because Ira posted a question before the video. I think it'd be great. So following up on that, how do you see yourselves and your organizations fitting in the Jewish prophetic tradition, right? This notion of going back to Isaiah and the prophets, and going back 2.5 millennia, but even in the last century with the Jews and civil rights 50 years ago, or the Jews 100 years ago involved in Zionism, involved in the Socialist Bund in Poland, in CCNY in the 30s, all the Jews involved in the Union. So how do you see what you're doing and your organizations are doing kind of fitting into this Jewish tradition?
I mean, I see it as building on that tradition. I think those are all antecedents, and we draw from them. We draw from both like the texts and the values that are in our tradition, but we also draw from history and the historical experience of Jews, and also how the many different ways we've organized ourselves politically. We see ourselves as a 21st century link in that chain.
And I think sort of just to build on what I was saying earlier was that, at least in my world, I think people are increasingly interested as being seen as religious Jews, or not even necessarily religious, but being seen as Jewish in the public square. Whereas I'm not an expert in that history, but I think Jews have always been disproportionately represented in the labor movement and in movements for justice, but not necessarily, sometimes yes, but I think overall not necessarily as Jews, quad Jews. And I think of late, mirroring other trends in American society, people really want to be out there as Jews because they feel like we have something to say that's different from what tends to be the white Christian narrative that is so dominant in our country.
And I actually have two theories and thoughts about that trend, if you'll indulge me for a second. One is that I think many American Jews are constantly trying to figure out how to organize their Jewish identity in American society. And, in earlier decades, it was about, for many, it was about being an immigrant community and about, the Landsmannschaft and, what are the communities in Europe, that folks came from. I think for a long time, the Jews understood themselves as that identification with Israel, and Zionist activism was a strong way that people organized their identities for a long period, overlapping ethnic identity and, being like an Ashkenazi bagels and lox kind of Yiddish identity was part of that. And I think that this generation of Jews are post those things. Most American Jews are long past the immigrant experience, and the younger people I work with don't have grandparents that all their grandparents grew up in the United States. That ethnic identity is, I think, more complicated than it once was. The Jewish community is, as T.I. is talking about, is diversifying very, very quickly in terms of racial diversity. And so like a strictly kind of Ashkenazi ethnic identification actually marginalizes a lot of the Jewish community and doesn't resonate as strongly with many, many people. And an uncomplicated Israel identification, I think, is we're post that time too. I think as everyone knows, how to understand Israel and how to kind of relate and connect to Israeli society as an American Jew is complicated. So we'll just leave it at that. But I think that for many American Jews, there is a pride still of being Jewish, and there is also a sense that being Jewish is about doing the right thing, about ethics. And so many Americans now see ethical issues when looking at the issues confronting our society, whether it's about LGBT human rights, whether it's about racial justice. And so it's only natural that they yearn to see a Jewish expression of that. That is, people I think are yearning for a Jewish community that expresses those things about things that they care very, very deeply about. And then the last thing I would say that I think has shifted is that in the last 4 years, certainly since Charlottesville, I would say, American Jews, increasingly at least young American Jews, increasingly understand that well, let me say it this way: white young American Jews understand more specifically that their privilege as white Americans in the society is actually provisional, and that there is a strong movement and a growing movement of people who don't think that Jews are white, that think that Jews are actually the ultimate enemy, and people understand. Many people are starting to understand that they have perhaps more in common with other groups that are targeted by these right-wing nationalist groups than they do with folks in power that are kind of amplifying them.
Thank you both. I have one question in the queue, which I think goes after your question. Do you want to repeat the question you posed before the video about the current Jewish political landscape?
Well, I just, as you know, Andrew, I'm real interested in what's the fate of American Jewry. And we have, at least by the pundits, we have these huge splits. They're not all political, but there's huge splits between, there's a minority that doesn't seem to be shrinking, doesn't seem to be growing from my perspective, of conservative Jews. Increasingly, it's Orthodox. And obviously, I know many Orthodox people who are very much on the progressive side. but there seems to be a huge and growing split. Israel's a part of it, but doesn't fully explain it. And it's probably not just in American Jewry, it's world Jewry that, I always think about the fall of the Second Temple and, rabbinic literature about this is based on baseless hatred. And we see a lot of baseless hatred in our community. So how do we bridge some of these things? How do we take our strong ethical views about what Judaism wants us to do, and also bridge some of these tremendous gaps within the Jewish community? That's basically my interest and my question. And you said there was a question that follows up on that?
No, it's a question that it's not directly connected to that, but it complements it, but I'll save it for after their answers.
I mean, I don't have the solution here. I would turn it over to you, Jason, if you feel like you can go like that, propose a solution. But I think a lot of it has to do with values and engaging around values. We try the value that JUFJ brings to this work is really often being one of the only groups that is values forward and really putting Jewish values out and ethical values out into a policy conversation. So I think the question of whether or not we think the prophetic tradition is the central idea of Judaism is not actually an argument that interests me a whole lot, because it is a very strong strand of Judaism. There are other equally strong strands of Judaism. And I think, hopefully everybody would agree that, say, like kavod habriot, human dignity, is a critical idea in Judaism. The disagreements and how that gets played out in the political arena is where we differ. But the ability to say we're talking about Jewish values here and we can agree on a Jewish value and then have a disagreement about how that plays out could be something that's unifying, or at least brings people together to be able to listen to one another by recognizing that they're operating in the same framework. But I'm not necessarily proposing that as an idea, just saying that I think it's sort of facile to argue about, well, the progressive Jews are just, they've adopted the Democratic Party platform and there's not much Judaism in it. And then for other folks to say that folks of other positions don't have any Judaism in their positions doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And we see, America as a whole has become hyper partisan. I don't know how to get us out of it, but I think it's also a fallacy to say, for example, that the Orthodox community has a particular monopoly on authentic Jewish values. And one of the places where that was really driven home to me this year was when the Orthodox Union endorsed I forget what a particular court case, I think they wrote an amicus brief on abortion that actually ran explicitly contradictory to some of the most central halakha about abortion. It was a position that was in accord with the political right, but it was not something that really jived with halakha. And I saw people across the Orthodox spectrum saying, what's going on here? This is actually if this passes, this is actually going to make it harder for me to fulfill the halakha and have the kind of consultation with my rabbi that I need to have, or that I would need to have in that particular situation, and then enact whatever it is. So I think there are other ways of constructing the conversation about what's going on and how we talk to each other in this moment. But I have no solutions there at this moment. Catch me in 2 weeks. Maybe I'll be feeling more optimistic.
And I'm going to answer that question by saying something provocative, which I think I believe, but I don't know if I believe it so strongly that I'm not willing to kind of argue about it. But and I say this as a committed pluralist, as someone who really values the different denominations and all the different expressions of Judaism. And what I want to say is, I don't think there is a Jewish community, and I don't think there is an American Jewish community. I think there are multiple Jewish communities, and that there are some parts of the Jewish community that do not see themselves as being in community with me. And community has to be a one-way, has to be a two-way street. It can't be a one-way street. So if you have, you have elements in the ultra-Orthodox community that will, call me not Jewish, and, the same thing as a Christian, and everyone who's on this Zoom call that will consider them not Jewish. The fact is, like, I'm not in Jewish community with those people. So, I'm interested in that. On a certain level, I'm interested intellectually in their expression of Judaism and how things have kind of come out in that way. But I'm not particularly pained to not be in relationship or on the same page as a group that has a different worldview and doesn't want to be in community with me.
So Jason, I hear you, and I can relate to much of what you say, but historically, and these things are often difficult to actually nail the history down. But what we know rabbinically, historically, this is not unprecedented. At the time of the fall of the Second Temple, we were knifing each other in Jerusalem. We were certain people were burning food supplies while we were under siege. And of course, that led both in that and the Bar Kokhba rebellion to probably up to the Holocaust, the greatest tragedy in Jewish history. So I don't know if I have an answer either, but that scares me. Not that history always repeats itself, but it does rhyme. We don't want this history to rhyme.
To be clear, I'm not advocating for that.
I know you're not. I know you're not advocating for that.
I think that's part of my and Jason's role as conservative rabbis in this world is to complicate things and to complicate people's picture of who liberal or progressive activists are and who religious people are. I can't tell you how many times, like I train young people and people are just like baffled to see me at, I'm speaking out early in my tenure, I think, on transgender protections in DC. And then to meet me and have a conversation with me and hear that I'm like pretty traditionally Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Kashrut and have all sorts of Jewish commitments, that like it's confusing and complicates the notion of who belongs in what camp. So I do see part of my work as being about that kind of complication and to bringing Judaism and to bringing religious praxis to people who maybe just have a political identity and vice versa. I'm also a committed pluralist and really have pretty close friends across a wide spectrum of the Jewish world and really enjoy playing that role there too, where people know me as a religious person, but can't fathom my political views. And so in some ways, I wonder if Jason and I are a little bit of a bridge between worlds.
Thank you. So let me get, before we close, let me get in this question from one of the people in the audience. I'll just read it. Regarding working, and this is kind of the flip side of working with non-Jewish organizations. Regarding working with allies, is there any conduct that disqualifies a potential ally from being a group that you should work with? Current anti-Semitic slurs, historic and unrepudiated anti-Semitic slurs, support for an active anti-Semite like Farrakhan.
I don't think we have time to get into it right now, but JUFJ certainly has red lines. There are certainly many of those categories that you read out would not be people that we would work with directly. But we also feel very strongly about not falling into what I see as a trap of guilt by association, that there are people who once had a conversation with Farrakhan or whatever it is. We don't not work with people just because of who they associate with. We do judge people based on their own actions, but I think that the entire world has gotten into this game of, gotcha, and we're not interested in that. We're interested in relationship, and quite honestly, if you want to change bad behavior, that doesn't that doesn't tend to happen unless you're in relationship with somebody and can say, our relationship is really important to me. You just did something that crossed the line or offended or was beyond the pale for us. You need to hear my story about why. And that works both ways. So yes, absolutely 100% there are red lines, and we try and stay away from the skilled by association in business.
Jason, and it's okay if we go over a few minutes.
Yeah, we have a similar approach, and I would definitely endorse both what Elizabeth said and how she said it. And I would say that for the most part, we are interested in working with allies that we are aligned with on the campaigns and issues that we work on. We don't, when you do coalition work, we may be on the opposite side of on other issues. So, you know, the simplest example is that, you know, we're close allies with the Catholic Church on some issues, issues of poverty, issues of economic justice, and then, you know, maybe on the opposite issues when it comes to reproductive justice. And in terms of red lines, besides, I don't want to work with anyone who's not strategic and doesn't have a real, you know, plan to be smart and to be effective and to win. I think one thing that I think is important to say is that when you work across lines of difference, whether it's racial difference or Jewish and not Jewish, or, you know, language and cultural differences, there's going to be times when you say the wrong thing or step on each other's toes, where, you know, countless times when I, as a white straight man, just by the way I'm raised, would say something that perhaps comes across as sexist or might be steeped in, you know, in racism in some way unintentionally. And what I hope is that, and like the times that I've appreciated it the most, is when people have pointed those things out to me, and hopefully I've learned and adjusted. And so when I do that with an ally or with a coworker, hopefully that builds trust that I'm someone who wants to learn and wants to strive to do better than I am. And if I were to just blow that off and either be defensive or say I don't care about that, or, you know, argue back, then I'd be someone who doesn't want to work with me. So and that is, you know, that's the case when it comes to Jewish things too. People will sometimes say things that are hurtful, or say, you know, have a position out of ignorance, and but luckily, you know, we'll be in relationship with them where we can teach. The progressive movement has not been very sophisticated and not particularly educated about anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism works, and how it's an oppression that kind of looks and smells different than other isms in society. And so it's complicated and confusing. So I'm really eager to be in conversation, and we do trainings and put out resources for the progressive movement to help folks be better, because many people are striving not to be that way. And, you know, just like everywhere, you know, there are, you know, people who are sexist, there are people who are, you know, sexism and racism and anti-Semitism plays itself out in our society everywhere. So it's, you know, it's including the progressive movement. But you know, it takes a deeper level of kind of distrust and pattern before I would, you know, on that pace, before I would say, you know, not interested in working with someone anymore.
Thank you. Ira, you want to have a last word?
No, I think that was a better last word than anything I can say.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. This was really terrific. Recorded for the ages. And so Thank you, Jason Kimmelman-Block, Elizabeth Richmond, Ira Foreman, for your efforts outside the Zoom on behalf of the Jewish community and humanity at large, and on behalf of Tifereth Israel in the Zoom. This is going to be kind of more or less every 4 to 6 weeks, we'll do one of these things. It take a little bit of work to set up, so I'm going to do them one at a time, but on the kind of candidate list are, again, all these people are in TI, climate change policy, health policy. I realize we have several people who ran for local office. That would be fun to talk to them about their experience. There's a few more, so stay tuned. Thank you all.
Andrew, I will say one last word.
Yes.
Which is thank you for all the work you're doing on these great programs.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew.
My pleasure. It's fun and opportunity to create community in new ways.
And I understand the bandwidth issue, but I miss seeing people's faces. So while we don't need to hear people talk, if people could turn their cameras on so we could just at least.
Okay. So everyone turn your camera on and wave goodbye to Jason, Elizabeth, and Ira, and then we'll close it up. So Rabbi Werbo, anything you want to say at the end here? Rabbi Werbo, no?
Thank you to everybody. It was great.
Okay, that's it. See y'all later. Shavua Tov.